Talking about Forgiving Jeff, it's episode 1, season 3 of Barry. At the conclusion of season 2, how much did you know about where you wanted to take Barry Block's story going forward?
What? Nothing really. We didn't know anything. We just kind of season 2 ended, and it was kind of like we had some ideas, but nothing concrete at all. We finished the episodes, I want to say, in early spring 2019 for season 2. And then we started back up writing season 3 in October of 2019. And then, so these episodes were, first day of, writing episode 1 of season 3 was kind of like, all right, so Kusano knows, what do we think? And I think very quickly that first meeting, I feel like I remember saying we should get rid of the acting class and let's just get right to it, instead of, if I was watching a show, I would start to get a little antsy if it turns into kind of like a cat and mouse thing with Kusano trying to get information and Barry doesn't know. And it, you know what I mean? It was just kind of like, let's just get to it. By doing that, it kind of, the writers and I just felt this kind of permission to, start kind of tearing it apart away. And it was kind of a bit like writing a new show, just more character focused, I think.
Did you find yourself getting a little bored with the structure that you had built over those first 2 seasons?
I get bored very easily. Yeah, I think there was a piece of me that during season 2 was like, we're ending with another Clash show. Like, we can't do this every season. Like, both season 1 and 2 ended with this Clash show thing, and it was like, we got to do something different. We wrote, I want to say, the first 4 episodes, and it outlines for the last 4 episodes of season 3. And we had our first table read, and then the next day the world shut down. And I think, we were about a week away from shooting. And so during that time, that year and a half, I was just, we kind of were mapping out what a season 4 could be. But in doing that, was going back and rewriting season 3. Actually, the tentpole scenes and the tentpole moments were all there. But again, it was just kind of honing it and focusing it. And in doing that, especially I'll say in the later episodes this season, it did come out quite dark. But it felt, and I don't know if that was just being in the middle of this pandemic.
So when we first see Barry this season, he does something extremely violent and kills 2 people. Kind of on a whim.
The original open of it was at a gas station at night, and he's talking to a guy, and the guy wants his wife killed. And Barry says, okay. And he gets the money from him, and then Barry kills that guy. And I remember the guy, he had his car in reverse, so the car starts to drift backwards. And I had this idea that the car would be drifting backwards, and Barry's kind of, we're dollying with Barry, tracking with Barry, while the car is kind of next to him while it's moving. And it was this kind of long orchestrated tracking shot. And, it was interesting. And I was like, oh, I think the shot could be really interesting. It's at night in LA, and, but it was all about that. It was kind of like, well, here's where he's at, It didn't really have anything to do with, as you're writing the show, these themes start to come up, of forgiveness. As we were doing that, that open just started to feel not right. And so I remember going into my office and just writing that new version, which is what you see.
So when I was watching that scene, it's a little bit Miller's Crossing. It's a little bit Cormac McCarthy, with the tree on the cliff. And you mentioned when you were originally conceiving the opening scene of this season that a shot was appealing to you, that you were like, I have a cool idea for how to shoot something. How much of that comes into it when you're in the writing process now, where you're like, I want to challenge myself as a filmmaker or whoever's directing the episode?
Yeah, I just like shots that tell a story, and it's like, how can we tell a story through, cinematically? And I think it's a thing, especially with television, that I think is an old kind of trope, is that it's not cinematic. It's all about talking heads and stuff. And I would love to be able to, I have the opportunity at HBO and everything, is to try to make it as cinematic as I can, because that's kind of what I enjoy. So yeah, definitely when I'm writing this stuff, it's always like, what are the shots? How can this tell a story? And And a good example of the thing I was telling you before at the gas station, it was just a shot. It didn't really tell you anything. It was just kind of like, oh, well, it's kind of interesting that, you know, maybe this thing's following him around and he can't get away from it or something. And that opening thing initially was like, well, this is just kind of about the shot. It's not really about anything else, you know.
Is it up?
So I'm
Is
glad
it
we
up to
changed
you to
it.
self edit that? Like, do you have to say I'm the, or like, will
Yeah,
Alec help you realize that, or is it always you saying like I'm not? This isn't the right idea.
it's usually me. It's usually me. Everyone else is like, yeah, it was great, man. That's the hard thing is everyone's usually like, awesome, you know. Now,
That's terrible.
when it comes to story stuff, Alec, Duffy Boudreaux, yeah, it's a different thing, where you're reading the scripts going, hey, you know what? I just looked at this scene and I really don't know if this is deep enough, or are we saying the right thing here? Or is this really what it should, what is the purpose of this? How
Mm.
does this move things forward? That's a big thing we say a lot is like, well, what am I getting? What's the new information? That's the thing that I've learned a lot from Alec and Liz Sarnoff because they have much more experience writing on television than I did when I started this thing. So everything has to kind of, move the story forward. For me, it was like, man, I just want to be directing. This is what I've always wanted, and then you get it and it's very overwhelming, and it's a lot of pressure on you.
One thing I've always loved about this show, I assume people tell you this show is 30 minutes long, and seasons are 8 episodes, and it is you can wrap your arms around it. It's clear what you're getting. But as you build out the show, is it harder to keep it this kind of tight little beautiful machine?
Yeah, you're constantly cutting stuff, and then if anything, it kind of goes back to what you were saying in terms of shots and stuff. You have to be just really hard on the material and kind of say like what matters, what doesn't. Our whole thing is always like, how's this move the plot along? And it's funny because we'll write. I was talking to Hiro Murai about this, where it's like you always feel like you've underwritten it, and then you shoot it all, and then you get in, and you're like, we have way too much stuff. We have to cut a bunch of
Mm.
stuff. So I think because I've now had the experience of 2 seasons, and then even during the 3rd season, as we were doing the 3rd season, in the middle of production, kind of going, yeah, we don't need that. We don't need that. It can go right from here to here. I feel like I had that confidence to say that. And I think, Alec as well, it was like, kind of like, oh, we know what the show is. And I tend to shoot not a lot of coverage and not a lot of takes. It's always very kind of, again, it's like from watching a lot of old movies, it's just this very, the thing I've said ad nauseum is simple dynamic coverage of just interesting shots. And I mean, I think this season what we try to do more is, one shot can turn into another, one nicely composed shot will turn into another nicely composed shot, or blocking was a bigger thing, you watch like, Polanski was really good at blocking, like, or those Polish movies in general. They do really interesting blocking in them. So, just watching that stuff. But I bring that up because that in and of it way keeps it tight. Doing everything in one kind of weirdly keeps it. You're like honing these scenes, and then those scenes become shots that you're honing, and then it just hopefully will just string together. And that's why the edit is always so nerve wracking because you want to see if it works. And then you get in there and you're like, oh my God, we undershot this. And, we did 2 weeks of reshoots in February. And that again was going back to scenes that didn't really work, or, we wrote wrong and things that we thought were important that weren't.
Season 3, episode 3. Ben Mendelsohn. Is this show still a comedy in your eyes?
I never see it as like a comedy or a drama or anything. It's just it's a comedy by the virtue that it's 30 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some very funny stuff in it, but when you're trying to do things and make it feel truthful, it's kind of like what we were talking about in the last episode, that scene with Barry and Cousineau on the couch. There was the version of that was funny, and then there's the version of it that's like, well, this is probably the more truer version of it. And sometimes we go too far one way and we'll start to dial it back in the performance or in the writing or even in the editing, where it's like, well, let's just cut from here to here. So we, this part is feeling a little too raw, And the same with the comedy. Sometimes we do stuff that's just too broad, and then we take it back. I think maybe the first episode of this we talked about how we did reshoots, because we wrote things wrong. And this episode has a couple of things that were just, it wasn't really on target. And one was the Hank stuff in this. Initially, it was about Hank feeling like he had to tell the other two guys that he was in a relationship with Cristobal. Because when we decided that we wanted to do that, we thought it was interesting that he would have to like come out to those guys. And this is what I mean by like, you go, oh, that's an interesting scene. Let's write that scene. And it was interesting, and their acceptance of him, and it was kind of funny how they were like, yeah, no shit, and all that stuff. But it wasn't on target for what the episode was. So it's like it was shot, and then you saw it, and then it really took Ali Greer and Frankie Gutman, our editors, who were like, so wouldn't they be freaked out because they were just hit in the last episode? And it was like, you're right.
I feel like we hear about reshoots on like Marvel movies and
Oh, yeah.
Jurassic Park movies, but we don't really hear about it on series television or smaller dramas or things like that. I mean, do you risk big pieces kind of falling out of place and things getting tangled and messed up when you start doing that kind of work after you've completed a season?
No, it's the opposite. You're solidifying it. It's kind of like you shot it and then you put it together and you realize like, oh, these things I thought were important are not important. They're like on their own interesting scenes, but they're not part of the arc. It's stuff you don't care about.
So I wanted to ask you about like writing the end of episodes, because it seems like a hard thing to do. And your show, I always get to the end and I'm like, fuck.
When you're working out the story, a lot of times I'm up at a whiteboard and everybody's kind of watching me, and I'm kind of just putting scenes kind of haphazardly in order. And then just something, and again, it's like kind of by feel, you just go, oh, it'd be great to end right here. Sometimes the outline will have another scene, and then you're writing it and you're feeling it out, and you go, you know what, it should end here. It just feels right. And this episode's actually pretty short. One of my favorite endings to a movie is A Serious Man. Like,
Oh
where
my
you
God,
see that,
my favorite of all time.
yeah, you see that tornado coming, and then it's like, whoa. And then you cut to black